After the tragic loss of his daughter Emily, Dr. James Callahan's life seems broken beyond repair, but everything changes when he discovers two boys at her grave. Boys she secretly mentored. This unexpected encounter sends James on a journey of rediscovery, from grief to hope, as he steps into a world of mentorship, resilience, and community transformation. What challenges will James and the boys face in a world full of doubts and divides? And how can Emily's quiet legacy grow into something that changes countless lives? If you're inspired by stories of redemption and the power of compassion, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Join us as we explore how one girl's belief sparks a movement that forever changes a family and a community. James Callahan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the wrought iron gates of Maplewood Cemetery. The early morning mist clung to the headstones, blurring their outlines into a sea of cold gray stone. In his hands, a bouquet of white lilies trembled, their petals delicate and ghostly against his dark coat. White lilies, Emily's favorite. He had brought them every week for 6 months, each visit another reminder of what he had lost. Steeling himself, he stepped out, the cold air biting at his face. At 49, James felt older than his years. His hair, once thick and dark, had thinned and turned silver at the temples. The stress of long hours as a cardiologist at Boston General had etched deep lines into his face, but nothing had aged him like grief. He walked the familiar path, each step echoing with memories of his daughter, Emily, a girl who had been a burst of color in his otherwise monochrome life. When he reached her grave, he kneeled, placing the flowers gently on the stone. The inscription, Emily Callahan, beloved daughter, mentor, and friend, seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. A lump rose in his throat as he whispered, "Hi, sweetheart, I'm back." The silence that followed was heavy, an emptiness that swallowed his words. James's days blurred together in a routine of surgeries and silent meals at home. The house, a sprawling colonial with gleaming hardwood floors and rooms that had once echoed with Emily's laughter, now felt vast and hollow. The kitchen was the hardest place to be, filled with little reminders. A mug she had painted with "Best Dad Ever" scrawled in uneven blue letters. A chipped magnet from her last school trip to New York. Laura, his ex-wife, had taken her grief back to California, leaving James to drown in his. Their separation had been inevitable, a consequence of years spent prioritizing his work over his family. Emily's death had shattered whatever fragile ties remained. He spent most nights in his study, surrounded by medical journals that no longer held his interest. But one evening, as he reached for a file, his hand brushed against an old chessboard. A memory surged up, teaching Emily how to play when she was 8, her face scrunched in concentration as he explained the strategies. "Think ahead, Emmy. Chess is like surgery. You need to see the whole board, not just the next move." She'd grinned at him, eyes bright with challenge. "I'll beat you one day, Dad." She never did, but she tried relentlessly. The following Saturday, James drove to the cemetery earlier than usual. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that stung the skin and made each breath visible. As he approached Emily's grave, he noticed 2 figures standing there. 2 boys, both around 14, with dark, curly hair and clothes that looked worn but neat. One held a piece of paper, his arm slung protectively around the other's shoulder. James's steps faltered, a mix of curiosity and irritation prickling under his skin. Who were they, and why were they at Emily's grave? The taller boy noticed him first and nudged his brother. They turned, eyes widening as they recognized the intruder. The taller one, Derek, stood a little straighter, but James could see the nervous flicker in his eyes. "We didn't mean any harm, sir," Derek said quickly. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he crumpled the paper behind his back. James softened, the sharp edge of his irritation blunted by the clear emotion in the boy's eyes. "I'm not here to scold you," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. I need to know, how did you know my daughter?" Caleb, the younger of the two, shifted closer to his brother, glancing up with wide eyes. "She was our tutor at the community center," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "More than that, she was our friend." The boy's words echoed in James' mind as he stood rooted to the spot. Emily had mentioned tutoring once or twice, but he'd never paid much attention, too wrapped up in surgeries and hospital board meetings. Now, faced with these boys who spoke of her with such reverence, he realized just how much of her life he had missed. "What did she teach you?" James asked, his gaze drifting to the piece of paper Caleb held. Derek swallowed hard. "Math. She said we could do more than just get by, that we could win scholarships, go to better schools." James blinked, the pieces falling into place. The Crestwood Academy Scholarship. He'd heard of it, a fiercely competitive prize that could change the trajectory of a student's future. His chest tightened as he realized Emily had been preparing them for something far bigger than he'd imagined. "Can I see that?" he asked, gesturing to the paper Caleb was holding. Caleb hesitated but handed it over. It was covered in complex equations and scribbled notes in Emily's neat handwriting. At the bottom, in a different color, were her final words of encouragement. "You can do this. Never forget how smart you are." James's vision blurred as he read the words, a sudden rush of pride and sorrow threatening to pull him under. That night, James sat at Emily's old desk in her room, surrounded by the remnants of her life, posters of her favorite bands, framed photos from school events, and trophies from debate club. He opened her desk drawers and sifted through notebooks and papers until he found a folder labeled Scholarship Prep. Derek and Caleb. Inside, he found detailed lesson plans, study notes, and practice tests she'd prepared for them. Each page was a testament to her commitment and compassion. He saw comments she'd written in the margins. "Great job. Try this method next time. Don't forget, you're capable of amazing things." A lump formed in his throat as he realized the depth of her investment in these boys' futures. She had seen potential where others saw none, and she had worked tirelessly to nurture it. James looked out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. He could almost hear Emily's voice, urging him to act, to do more than just mourn. And for the first time since her death, he felt a spark of purpose. The following morning, James woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. He made coffee, the rich scent filling the kitchen, mingling with the cold morning air seeping through a cracked window. His eyes drifted to the chipped mug Emily had painted, its blue letters spelling "Best Dad Ever." He wrapped his fingers around the handle and sipped, feeling the bittersweet reminder of her optimism. That day, James found himself driving to the community center, a modest building nestled between a laundromat and a convenience store. It was unassuming, with chipped paint and a sign that read, "Open Hearts, Open Minds" in faded letters. He parked and sat for a moment, the hum of the city muffled by the closed car windows. He hadn't set foot in a place like this since his early days as a medical resident, volunteering at local clinics. Inside, the energy of the place was palpable. Kids of all ages were scattered around, some playing chess, others hunched over homework with determined expressions. He scanned the room until he spotted Mrs. Parker, the center's director, organizing a stack of books at the front desk. She looked up, her sharp eyes softening with recognition. "Dr. Callahan," she said, her voice measured but warm. "I heard about Emily. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you," he managed, throat tightening. "I'm here because I met two of her students, Derek and Caleb." A smile broke through her initial wariness. "Ah, yes. Those boys are special." Emily was always singing their praises. She saw something in them that even they didn't see in themselves. James nodded, trying to anchor himself in the steady rhythm of her words. "I want to help them. Continue what Emily started, if that's okay." Mrs. Parker's expression shifted to one of understanding, her gaze softening. "We'd be glad to have you here. Emily's legacy deserves to be carried forward." James' first day at the community center as a mentor was anything but smooth. Derek and Caleb were surprised when they saw him enter, their faces a mix of relief and suspicion. The memory of their encounter at Emily's grave was still fresh, and James could sense their hesitance. He approached the boys cautiously, offering a small smile. "Mind if I join you today?" he asked, holding up a math textbook. Derek exchanged a glance with Caleb before nodding. "Sure, Mr. Callahan," he said, his tone polite but guarded. They settled into a rhythm over the next hour, working through practice problems. Derek's brow furrowed with concentration as James explained the steps to solve a complex algebraic equation. Caleb, more tentative, scribbled notes, glancing up every now and then to ask questions. Midway through the session, Derek put his pencil down and looked directly at James. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. James took a moment before answering. "Because Emily believed in you, and I owe it to her to see this through. But more than that, I believe in you too." Derek's eyes searched James's face, as if looking for a lie, but found none. He nodded once, a silent agreement passing between them. Balancing his responsibilities at the hospital with his newfound mentorship was harder than James anticipated. Mornings were spent in surgery, where he had to be precise and detached. His mind focused solely on the life under his scalpel. But by afternoon, he'd swap his scrubs for a casual sweater and head to the community center, where the stakes felt equally high but infinitely more personal. His colleagues began to notice the change. Dr. Warren, a senior surgeon and longtime friend, cornered him in the doctor's lounge one day. "James, you've been stretched thin lately. Everything all right?" James hesitated, the familiar weight of guilt pressing down. "Just managing some things outside of work," he said, taking a sip of lukewarm coffee. Dr. Warren's eyes narrowed but softened with concern. "Just don't forget to take care of yourself, too. We all admired Emily, you know. If this is about her, we understand." The mention of Emily caught him off guard, but he nodded. Thanks, Warren. I'll be fine." The weeks rolled on, and James began to see the first signs of progress. Caleb grew more confident in his answers, and Derek's eyes lit up with understanding when he mastered a difficult concept. The boys opened up gradually, sharing snippets of their lives, how their grandmother, Mrs. Wilson, raised them after their parents passed away, and how they hoped to make her proud by getting into Crestwood Academy. One afternoon, James brought up Emily. "She talked about you two at home sometimes," he said, watching their reactions carefully. "I think she saw something of herself in you." Caleb smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. "She told us stories about how she struggled with math at first, but that her dad taught her tricks to get better." James's heart tightened. "She told you that?" he asked, surprised by the rush of warmth that memory brought. Derek nodded. "Yeah. She said that's why she wanted to help us, so we'd know we could do more." For the first time in months, James felt a fleeting moment of peace. He wasn't just continuing her work. He was getting to know her in a way he hadn't when she was alive. One evening, as James packed up after another tutoring session, Mrs. Parker approached him with a small smile. "I haven't seen Derek and Caleb this motivated in months. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." James looked around the center, at the kids who lingered to play games or ask questions about their homework. It was more than a place to study. It was a sanctuary, one Emily had helped build piece by piece. As he left that night, James walked past a bulletin board covered with photos and clippings. His eye caught a picture of Emily standing beside Derek and Caleb, all three of them laughing at something out of frame. He stopped and traced the edge of the photo, a smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks for guiding me, Em," he whispered, the quiet of the empty hallway carrying his words. The day of the boys' interviews for Crestwood Academy arrived with a biting wind that swept through the city streets. James stood outside the school's imposing stone facade, watching Derek and Caleb take deep breaths before stepping inside. The twins wore their best clothes, a couple of second-hand blazers that Mrs. Wilson had pressed meticulously the night before. "Remember," James said, catching Derek's eye, "you've earned your place here. Just be yourselves." Derek nodded, a hint of determination in his eyes. Caleb, always the quieter one, offered a small, reassuring smile before they disappeared through the grand doors. Inside, the boys were met with polished floors and long hallways lined with framed photos of Crestwood's alumni. Doctors, politicians, artists. The sight was daunting, and whispers followed them as they made their way to the admissions office. The interview room was sleek and cold, with the board members seated behind an oak table. James watched through the glass as the boys sat down, nerves tightly coiled. He could only hope the admissions committee would see them as Emily had, as more than 2 kids from the community center. The following days felt like an eternity. Derek and Caleb spent most of their time at the community center, alternating between bursts of studying and moments of anxious silence. James joined them whenever he could, dividing his attention between them and the growing responsibilities at the hospital. His colleagues' questions became more pointed, and Dr. Warren's concern turned to quiet frustration. "You're here physically, James," Dr. Warren said, after an intense surgical procedure. "But your mind is somewhere else. If you need time, take it." James looked at him, the weight of dual responsibilities pressing down. "I can't," he replied. "Not when it matters so much." He found himself at the community center late one evening, helping Caleb with a particularly challenging geometry problem. Mrs. Wilson approached, carrying cups of steaming tea. She handed one to James, her eyes kind and knowing. "They're so close," she said softly. "You've done more for them than anyone ever has, James." He met her gaze, gratitude mixing with guilt. "Emily did this," he said. "I'm just following her lead." Mrs. Wilson smiled, a tear catching in the corner of her eye. "And that's why it's working." The acceptance calls from Crestwood came 3 days later. Derek was the first to answer, his voice cracking as he repeated, "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." He hung up, eyes wide and glistening. "We got in," he said, barely above a whisper. Caleb looked stunned, then broke into a grin that lit up his whole face. James, who had been sitting on the edge of a folding chair, exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he laughed, a sound raw with joy and release. Mrs. Parker rushed in, drawn by the noise, and when she saw their faces, she clapped her hands. "I knew it," she said, pulling the boys into a fierce hug. James watched the scene, a warmth spreading through him. He felt Emily's spirit in that room, in the smiles and the tears, and he knew she was proud. The boys' acceptance at Crestwood, however, was met with mixed reactions. At the community center, they were celebrated as proof that hard work could break barriers. But whispers floated around Crestwood's halls, not all of them kind. The word scholarship took on a sharp edge, muttered by students who passed them in the hallway. James sensed the strain it placed on Derek and Caleb. Derek, who had always worn his determination like armor, started coming home from school with a tightness around his eyes. Caleb, ever the observer, withdrew into quiet resilience, saying less and watching more. One afternoon, James found Derek in the library, his textbooks open but untouched. "You want to talk about it?" James asked, sitting down across from him. Derek didn't look up. "They think we don't belong," he said finally. "That we're just here because of you, because of Emily." James felt a familiar ache in his chest. "You're here because you earned it. Emily only helped you see what was already there." Derek met his eyes, the fight in him flickering back to life. "Then we'll show them," he said, the words more for himself than anyone else. Not everyone at Crestwood doubted them. Dr. Harrison, the chemistry teacher who had admired Emily's intellect, stepped up to offer extra help during difficult labs and assignments. He addressed the class one day, looking pointedly at a group of students who had made offhand remarks about Derek and Caleb. Thomas Edison once said, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." "I see a lot of genius here," Dr. Harrison said, his eyes landing on Derek and Caleb. "And I'm not talking about the usual suspects." The murmurs died down, and for a brief moment, Derek and Caleb felt seen. News of the boys' acceptance and the challenges they faced reached Laura in California. She called James one evening, her voice hesitant but warm. "I'm proud of you," she said. "And them, I want to come and see it for myself." James felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. "We'd like that," he said, thinking of how long it had been since she'd seen the boys or set foot in Boston. Laura arrived on a chilly spring morning. The boys greeted her shyly at first, unsure of her connection to Emily beyond being her mother. But as the day unfolded, they shared stories of Emily's tutoring, her jokes, and the snacks she'd bring to the center. Laura listened, tears threatening but held back by pride. As evening fell, Laura and James stood in the quiet kitchen, the hum of conversation drifting from the living room where Mrs. Wilson and the boys were playing chess. "You're different," Laura said, looking at James. "Less closed off." "I had to be," he replied. "Emily taught me that." Laura nodded, and in the silence, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The excitement from their acceptance into Crestwood began to wane as Derek and Caleb settled into the relentless demands of their new school. While some classmates had softened after seeing their academic dedication, others held tightly to their assumptions. James could see the toll it was taking. Derek's confident stride grew more measured, and Caleb's quiet nature became more reserved. One evening, Derek stayed behind at the community center after everyone else had left. James found him sitting by the window, his books forgotten on the table. "You're still here," James said, taking a seat next to him. Derek didn't look up. "It's hard, Mr. Callahan. No matter how hard we try, there's always someone who thinks we don't belong. I know we should ignore it, but sometimes it's all I can hear." James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Emily once told me that the hardest battles aren't the ones people see. They're the ones you fight in your own mind. She knew what it was like to feel out of place, but she stayed because she believed she could change things, one person at a time." Derek turned to face him, eyes reflecting the weight of his determination. "Then we have to keep going," he said, more to himself than to James. The next day at Crestwood, Derek and Caleb faced their challenges head-on. They partnered with classmates for a chemistry project, choosing not to let the sideways glances deter them. One of their partners, a girl named Rachel, was initially reserved but soon warmed up to Caleb's quiet brilliance when he demonstrated a clever solution to a problem they'd been stuck on. "Where'd you learn that?" Rachel asked, curiosity replacing skepticism. "Emily taught us," Caleb replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. It was the first time he'd said her name in class, and it felt like a quiet act of defiance. Word of their abilities started to spread, slowly chipping away at the stereotypes some had clung to. Dr. Harrison noticed and invited them to join Crestwood's math club, a move that surprised everyone, including Derek and Caleb. It was an acknowledgement that couldn't be dismissed. But with recognition came the weight of expectations. Derek pushed himself harder, staying up late to study and skipping lunch to go over notes. James noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way he hunched over his books like they were shields. "You can't run on empty, Derek," James said one evening as they packed up at the community center. "I know," Derek replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He glanced at Caleb, who was folding a chessboard they had used to unwind between sessions. "It's just, we can't fail. Not after everything." James stepped closer, placing a hand on Derek's shoulder. "Pushing yourself to exhaustion won't honor Emily's memory. Trust me, I've been where you are. Sometimes resting is the most courageous thing you can do." Derek's expression softened, the tightness in his jaw relaxing. Caleb nodded in silent agreement, understanding the unspoken truth in James's words. As spring turned to early summer, Crestwood's academic year ramped up in intensity. Just when things seemed to be stabilizing, a rumor began to spread through the halls that Crestwood was considering reducing its scholarship programs due to funding concerns. The whisper of budget cuts felt like a storm cloud brewing over Derek and Caleb's hard-won place. James heard about it during a lunch break at the hospital. Mrs. Parker called, her voice laced with urgency. "James, the boys are worried. There's talk that the scholarships might be cut back next year. It's rattling everyone at the center." James felt a surge of protectiveness. He knew what it took for Derek and Caleb to make it this far. Losing that support now would be devastating. He reached out to Dr. Harrison, who confirmed that while the school board was discussing budget adjustments, nothing had been decided. The boys approached James that evening, their usually bright eyes clouded with concern. "If the scholarships go away, what happens to us?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling just enough for James to notice. James knelt so he was at eye level with them. "We're not going to let that happen," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't just about you two. It's about making sure other kids who come after you get the same chance." Derek nodded slowly, a spark of determination rekindled. "Then we'll fight for it." James didn't waste time. He met with Mrs. Parker and other community leaders, brainstorming how they could support the boys and rally the neighborhood. Mrs. Wilson, who usually stayed in the background, surprised everyone by offering to host a community meeting at the center. When the day of the meeting arrived, the room was filled with parents, students, and local teachers. Derek and Caleb stood at the front, facing their community with nervous smiles. James spoke first, explaining the potential threat to the scholarships and what it would mean for students like Derek and Caleb. Then Derek stepped forward. "Emily believed in us when no one else did," he said, his voice steady. "She taught us that opportunities shouldn't depend on where you come from or how much money your family has. If we lose this chance, it won't just be us. It'll be everyone who believed they could be more." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. Parents signed petitions, teachers offered to write letters of support, and James reached out to local media to share the story of the community's fight for educational equity. The final test came with the Crestwood board meeting. James stood before the panel, dressed in a suit, but feeling the weight of every parent and student behind him. He spoke not just as a father who had lost his daughter, but as someone who understood the power of second chances. These boys didn't just earn their place here, they've proven that diversity enriches this school, he said, his voice unwavering. Emily gave them the tools, but it's their dedication and resilience that keep them here. Cutting these programs would be a step backward, not forward. The room was silent for a moment that stretched on before Dr. Benson, the board member known for his fairness, nodded. "We need to consider not just budgets, but the stories behind them. Let's not forget what Crestwood stands for." By the end of the meeting, the scholarship programs were preserved. Derek and Caleb's futures, along with those of countless other students, remained secure. James exhaled as he left the room, the relief mingled with pride. They had done it. Not just him, not just the boys, but an entire community standing as one. With the school year behind them, summer brought a mixture of relief and new challenges for Derek and Caleb. Crestwood had become less intimidating, but they knew the upcoming year would be even more demanding. James continued to mentor them, splitting his time between his work at the hospital and tutoring sessions at the community center. One day, James received a call from Laura. She'd been following the news of the scholarship fight and wanted to help with the fund's next initiative. "I've been thinking about Emily's impact," she said. "I want to be part of it, James. I'm moving back to Boston." James was stunned into silence. It had been so long since they'd shared anything beyond strained conversations. "We'd love to have you here," he said, feeling the weight of old grief give way to a new, unexpected hope. Laura's return marked a turning point, not just for James, but for Derek and Caleb too. She visited the community center, helping organize workshops and speaking to the parents about the power of mentorship. Derek, who had initially been wary of the woman who shared Emily's blue eyes and steady demeanor, soon warmed up to her. Caleb's quiet nature responded well to her patient encouragement. One evening, Laura joined them for a tutoring session. She watched as James explained a complex physics problem, his voice calm but firm. When Caleb finally solved the problem, a smile spread across his face, and Laura's heart swelled. "You're really good at this," she told James later, over coffee in the center's modest kitchen. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a bridge, a step toward mending the years that grief had frayed. Word of James's mentorship and the scholarship fund spread beyond their neighborhood. More students began showing up at the center, eager for tutoring and guidance. Mrs. Parker expanded the programs, adding summer chess matches inspired by Emily's lessons. Derek and Caleb often led these sessions, showing younger kids how to think ahead, just as Emily had taught them. James found himself at the center nearly every evening, surrounded by the hum of conversation and laughter. It was a stark contrast to the silence of his house after Emily's death. Laura became a regular presence too, working with Mrs. Wilson to coordinate meals and activities for the kids. The twins' dedication to their new roles inspired others. Parents who once felt disconnected began volunteering, helping with everything from homework assistance to meal prep. The center was no longer just a place to study. It had become a hub of hope and community. Despite the progress, not everything came easily. Derek struggled with the expectations placed on him. "What if I can't keep up next year?" he confessed one evening after a tutoring session. James had noticed his furrowed brow, the way he lingered at the table long after Caleb had left. "You're not alone in this," James reminded him. "You've got me, Caleb, Mrs. Parker, and everyone at the center. It's okay to be scared, but don't let it stop you." Derek nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease completely. The next day, James brought up the topic during their chess game. "You know, I used to doubt myself before surgeries. Every time I picked up a scalpel, there was a voice that said, 'What if this time you can't do it?' But then I thought about the training, the practice, and the people counting on me." Derek moved his knight, finally meeting James's gaze. "I guess it's the same with school." "Exactly," James said, a small smile breaking through. "You're prepared? You just have to trust that." Midway through the summer, an incident threatened to undo the progress they'd made. A group of kids outside Crestwood, emboldened by rumors and prejudices, confronted Derek and Caleb on their way home. Words were exchanged, harsh, cutting reminders of the barriers that still existed. Derek pushed Caleb behind him, his fists clenching. "Leave us alone," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. One of the boys sneered. "Just remember, you're here on borrowed time." James found out about the incident when Caleb, shaken but unharmed, mentioned it at the community center. Derek said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. James felt a familiar anger rise, the kind that came when he thought about the things Emily had fought for. "We're not going to let this go," James said. "Not this time." James brought the incident to the attention of Crestwood's administration and local community leaders. Dr. Harrison stepped up, speaking out about the importance of creating an environment where all students felt safe and valued. Mrs. Parker organized a town hall meeting, inviting parents, teachers, and students to discuss the underlying issues. Laura spoke at the meeting, her voice steady. "This isn't just about two boys. It's about what we stand for as a community. Emily believed in them, and she believed in us. We can't let her down." The show of support surprised Derek and Caleb. They watched as neighbors and classmates, even some who had once been skeptical, stood up to advocate for change. Derek looked at Caleb, the weight of the past few days lightened by the sight of so many people on their side. "Maybe we really do belong here," he said, the doubt in his voice fading. By the end of the summer, the community center was busier than ever. New programs were launched, focusing on leadership and academic resilience. Derek and Caleb took on mentoring roles, guiding younger students who reminded them of their own journey. James and Laura stood by the entrance one evening, watching the boys teach a group of kids how to play chess. The room was filled with laughter, determination, and the kind of energy that spoke of hope. "She'd be proud," Laura said, her eyes misty as she glanced at James. "I know," he replied, a smile softening his features. "She already is." The weeks after the incident tested Derek and Caleb's resilience, but they emerged stronger, bolstered by the community's support. James watched with a mixture of pride and concern as the boys navigated the lingering effects of what had happened. He knew that words alone couldn't erase the sting of that encounter, but he saw how Derek walked a little taller when he entered the community center, and how Caleb's smile was more determined when he greeted new kids. Mrs. Parker, never one to stand by passively, introduced a new mentorship program called Voices for Change, where older students could share their experiences and guide younger ones. Derek and Caleb were asked to lead the first session. At first, Derek hesitated. "Why us?" he asked James one evening, tapping a pencil nervously against his notebook. "Because people listen to leaders," James said, "and whether you see it or not, that's what you've become." Caleb nodded in quiet agreement. "We owe it to Emily," he said softly. The first session was held in the crowded multi-purpose room of the center. Derek spoke about the challenges they faced at Crestwood and the lessons learned along the way. Caleb added stories of encouragement, the times when Emily's lessons had pushed them forward. By the end, The room buzzed with hope and determination, and a line of younger kids formed, eager to ask questions and share their own stories. James stood at the back of the room, watching the exchange with pride. Next to him, Mrs. Wilson, the twins' grandmother, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "They're turning into young men right before our eyes," she whispered. "Emily would have loved this," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. The Voices for Change program quickly became one of the center's most popular initiatives. It wasn't just about sharing stories, it was about building trust, breaking down barriers, and showing kids that they weren't alone. The boys' leadership inspired other students to step forward and share their own challenges, creating a ripple effect that stretched beyond the center's walls. Laura's involvement grew as she found purpose in working with the community center. She proposed a project that combined her experience in educational consulting with her passion for supporting the center's mission, a scholarship workshop series. The workshops would teach parents and students how to navigate application processes, write compelling essays, and find financial aid opportunities. The first session drew dozens of families, some who had never considered higher education a possibility. Laura spoke with clarity and empathy, making the overwhelming seem achievable. Derek and Caleb, standing at the front as success stories, shared how Emily's belief in them had been the starting point. "Sometimes it takes just one person believing in you," Caleb said, his eyes scanning the room. "But it's up to you to take the next step." James watched from the sidelines, the ache of grief mingled with a deep sense of fulfillment. His family wasn't what it used to be, but in its place was something new, fragile yet resilient. Sunday dinners at Mrs. Wilson's house had become a tradition that James and Laura looked forward to. The meals were simple but filled with warmth and laughter. Derek and Caleb shared stories about their days at Crestwood, the classes they loved, and the teachers who'd become unexpected allies. One evening, as they sat around the table, Mrs. Wilson raised her glass. "To Emily," she said, her voice strong despite the tremble of emotion, "for teaching us all that hope can grow from the hardest places." They all clinked glasses, the room filled with a quiet, shared understanding. James met Laura's eyes, and in that moment, the past felt lighter. The summer began to fade into late August, and the air carried the first hints of autumn. Derek and Caleb prepared for their second year at Crestwood, armed not just with textbooks, but with a newfound sense of belonging. The community center buzzed with back-to-school energy, with students excitedly discussing their plans and parents helping where they could. James found himself working late into the evenings, meeting with parents and connecting new mentors with students. Laura coordinated supplies and led more scholarship workshops, which continued to draw larger crowds. The partnership between them felt seamless, built on shared grief, respect, and a shared goal: to honor Emily's legacy through action. One afternoon, Derek approached James with a hesitant smile. "We want to start a club at Crestwood," he said. "A mentoring club, like Voices for Change. We thought it could help bring kids together who feel like they don't belong." James's heart swelled with pride. "That's an incredible idea," he said. "Let's make it happen." With James and Dr. Harrison's support, Derek and Caleb's idea gained traction. The school approved their request, and soon, Voices for Change had a new chapter at Crestwood. The club focused on bridging gaps between scholarship students and their peers, offering a space for stories, tutoring, and shared experiences. The first meeting was packed, with students filling every available seat. Derek stood at the front, his voice steady as he spoke. "We're here to support each other, to remind ourselves that everyone belongs, no matter where they come from or what they're going through." Caleb added, "This isn't just a club, it's a way to make sure no one feels alone." James stood near the back, taking it all in. The boys were no longer just students trying to find their place, they were leaders shaping the world around them. Laura stood beside him, her hand brushing his in a brief but meaningful touch. They exchanged a glance filled with pride and quiet joy. The momentum of Voices for Change extended beyond Crestwood Academy. News of the club's success reached local media, leading to an article in the Boston Gazette titled, "Scholarship Students Transform School Culture." The piece highlighted Derek and Caleb's leadership and the club's mission to bridge divides within the student body. James clipped the article and tacked it to the bulletin board at the community center. It was becoming a symbol of how far they had all come since that first encounter at Emily's grave. He watched as students gathered around to read it, their eyes bright with hope. One afternoon, Mrs. Parker called James over as he helped set up tables for a workshop. "The kids are talking about how they want to start clubs like Voices for Change at their schools," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "Your work is planting seeds all over the city." James felt a swell of pride. It wasn't just about Derek and Caleb anymore. It was about a community coming together to ensure every student knew they were seen and valued. As the school year began, Derek and Caleb found themselves balancing their academic responsibilities with their roles as club leaders. The demands were high, and there were moments when exhaustion threatened to overtake them. One evening, Caleb fell behind on an important chemistry project. Frustrated, he stared at the open textbook until the words blurred. Derek noticed and nudged him with a pen. "Take a break, Callie. We've got time." Caleb sighed, shaking his head. "Feels like there's never enough time." James, who had just arrived from the hospital, overheard them. He set his bag down and approached the table. "You're doing great," he said. "But remember, it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to do this alone." Derek glanced at Caleb, then at James. "We're learning that," he admitted. James nodded, pride in his gaze. "Good. It's a lesson even adults struggle with." Despite their growing support network, not everyone welcomed the changes at Crestwood. Some parents, concerned about the school's direction, attended a board meeting to express their reservations. James was invited to speak on behalf of Voices for Change, but before he could respond, Dr. Harrison stepped forward. "These students have brought something invaluable to our school," Dr. Harrison said, addressing the board and the audience. "They've shown that leadership and resilience come from more than just privilege. Derek and Caleb's contributions have enriched not just their peers, but the entire culture at Crestwood." A murmur spread through the crowd, this time more supportive than critical. The pushback from some parents didn't vanish overnight, but it softened in the face of growing evidence that the club and its leaders were making a difference. One Saturday, James and Laura organized a community event at the center to celebrate the expansion of the scholarship fund. It was an evening of storytelling, games, and speeches that brought together families, teachers, and students. Mrs. Wilson, with her ever-present warmth, addressed the crowd. "I remember when Derek and Caleb first told me about Emily," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I worried for them, but they proved that love and determination can carry you through anything. And that's what this place stands for." Derek and Caleb sat beside James, listening to the applause. Derek turned to James with a smile. "This is bigger than us now," he said. James felt his eyes mist. "Yes, it is. And that's the point." As the evening wound down, Laura took the stage. She glanced at James, who gave her a nod of encouragement. "When we lost Emily, I didn't know if we'd ever find a way to move forward," she began. "But seeing what this center has become, and how it's helped not just Derek and Caleb, but so many others, it's clear that her spirit is alive here." Applause filled the room, a wave of unity and shared purpose that resonated deeply. Derek and Caleb stood, their faces a mix of pride and gratitude. The event was more than a celebration. It was a reminder that healing was possible when a community stood together. Later that evening, as the last guests left and the center quieted down, James and Laura sat on the front steps. The night air was cool, carrying the faint sounds of laughter from a nearby park. "She would have loved tonight," Laura said, her voice breaking slightly. "Seeing everyone come together like this." James nodded, the ache in his chest softer than it once was. "I think she's proud of all of us." Laura's eyes met his, and they shared a moment that spoke of forgiveness, acceptance, and the strength to move forward, not as a fractured family, but as part of a larger, supportive community. Derek and Caleb's club at Crestwood gained momentum, drawing in more students who wanted to be part of something meaningful. They organized their first joint project with the community center, a mentorship day where Crestwood students tutored younger kids. reinforcing the lessons they'd learned. James watched as Derek explained a math problem to a boy who looked up at him with wide eyes. Caleb was across the room, teaching a small group how to play chess. The room buzzed with energy, the boundaries between school and community melting away. Laura walked over, a smile on her face. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked. "Yes," James said, feeling the truth of the words resonate within him. "It's just the beginning." With the mentorship day hailed as a success, more Crestwood students volunteered at the community center. The once segregated groups of scholarship kids and regular students began to blur as stories were shared and friendships formed. Derek and Caleb's club meetings at Crestwood gained traction. Attended by students from various backgrounds who felt inspired to challenge their assumptions and work together. James noticed the change not only in Derek and Caleb, but in the atmosphere at the community center. The space felt brighter, more alive with the chatter of students discussing their goals, their stories, and their dreams. Even Mrs. Parker, who had seen countless programs come and go, admitted it was different this time. "It's like there's a fire here," she said to James one evening as they watched a group of kids play chess. "A fire that started with Emily and has been carried by everyone who believed in what she stood for." As the fall semester at Crestwood advanced, Derek and Caleb faced an unexpected setback. An exam week filled with high-stakes tests and looming deadlines brought pressure unlike anything they had experienced before. Derek, who usually thrived under pressure, struggled with fatigue. Caleb, always meticulous, found himself second-guessing his answers during a particularly difficult chemistry test. James, noticing the change in their demeanor, sat them down after their evening session. "I see you both pushing yourselves too hard," he said, concern etching lines into his face. "It's okay to reach out for help." Caleb looked up, worry darkening his usually calm eyes. "But what if we don't meet expectations? What if we fail?" James took a deep breath. "Failure is just another step toward growth. Emily didn't succeed at everything she tried, but she never let that stop her. What matters is that you keep going, and you lean on those who are here to support you." Derek nodded, the weight of his self-imposed expectations easing a little. "We'll try," he said. It wasn't an immediate solution, but it was a start. Word of the boys' struggles reached Dr. Harrison, who approached them after class. "I know things can get overwhelming," he said, folding his arms as he looked between Derek and Caleb. "But remember, you don't have to do it alone. That's why we have these clubs, these groups, to remind you that you're part of a team." The message resonated, and during the next Voices for Change meeting, Derek admitted to the group that he'd been feeling the pressure. The room fell silent, the other students listening intently. Then, one by one, others shared their own challenges, stories of stress and doubt. By the end, the atmosphere felt lighter, as if sharing their struggles had chipped away at the isolation they all sometimes felt. Caleb later remarked to Derek, "Maybe asking for help isn't a weakness after all." "No," Derek said with a small smile. "Maybe it's what keeps us strong." Laura organized another scholarship workshop at the community center, this time featuring a panel of past scholarship recipients, including Derek and Caleb. The event drew a large crowd of parents and students eager to learn and share. During the panel, Derek spoke about the challenges they faced, not just academically, but socially. "We're not just here because someone handed us a chance," he said, his voice steady and sure. "We're here because we worked for it. But more importantly, we're here because people believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves." Caleb added, "And that's why this community matters. It's not just about the grades or the awards. It's about lifting each other up so we can all move forward together." James and Laura exchanged proud looks, their hearts swelling as they saw how the boys had not only embraced their roles, but used them to inspire others. That evening, after the successful workshop, James and Laura sat with Mrs. Parker in the now quiet center. The room was dimly lit, the echoes of the evening's conversations lingering in the air. Mrs. Parker took a sip of her tea and glanced at James. "You've come a long way, James," she said, her voice carrying a tone of fond acknowledgement. "From the man who barely spoke when he first stepped in here to the one leading us forward. James chuckled, a soft, wistful sound. "It wasn't just me," he said, glancing at Laura, who nodded. "It was everyone. Emily, Derek, Caleb, the entire community. I just finally learned how to listen." Laura smiled, leaning back in her chair. "And to act when it mattered." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared loss now a thread that bound them rather than an anchor that dragged them down. The first anniversary of Voices for Change approached, and the boys, along with James, Laura, and Mrs. Parker, planned a celebration at the community center. It was a way to reflect on the past year and set new goals. The event drew people from all walks of life: parents, teachers, students, and even former skeptics who had witnessed the program's impact. Derek stood on stage, looking out at the familiar faces. "A year ago, I didn't know if we'd fit in at Crestwood. But we learned that fitting in isn't what matters. It's making a place that welcomes others, too." Caleb followed with, "We couldn't have done this alone. And we don't want anyone else to feel like they have to." The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. James felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. The grief he carried was still there, but now it coexisted with hope and pride. The room was full of life, the kind Emily would have been part of, had fate allowed. As the evening wound down, James stood with Laura and watched Derek and Caleb talking animatedly with a group of younger kids. The scene felt complete, a testament to resilience, unity, and the quiet power of choosing to move forward. "We did it, Em," James whispered under his breath, the noise of the crowd softening as if to give space to the sentiment. "We're still moving forward." The start of a new school year at Crestwood Academy brought fresh faces and new challenges. Derek and Caleb, now seasoned leaders, took on the task of welcoming new scholarship students and guiding them through their first weeks. The boys' confidence had grown, not just in their academic abilities, but in their roles as mentors and role models. James watched them from a distance, pride etched into every line of his face. He had become more than a mentor. He was now part of a network of parents and teachers who supported programs that encouraged inclusivity and opportunity. Laura, too, was thriving in her expanded role at the community center, organizing workshops and reaching out to new families. One afternoon, Derek approached James with an idea. "We were thinking of expanding Voices for Change," he said. "What if we included workshops that teach leadership skills, not just for scholarship students, but for everyone?" James felt a rush of excitement. "That's exactly what this place needs," he said. "Let's make it happen." The leadership workshops were an immediate hit. Held on Saturdays at the community center, they brought together students from various schools who might not have crossed paths otherwise. The workshops covered everything from public speaking to conflict resolution, with James and Laura sometimes stepping in to share lessons learned through their own experiences. Mrs. Parker marveled at the turnout one morning. "It's incredible," she said to James. "This center has always been a beacon, but now it's a bridge." Derek and Caleb took turns leading discussions, often encouraging quieter students to share their thoughts. Caleb, once reserved, had found his voice, using empathy and insight to draw others out of their shells. Derek's charisma inspired confidence, making even the most uncertain students feel seen. "We're not just here to learn," Derek said during one workshop. "We're here to help each other succeed." The workshops became a symbol of what Voices for Change stood for, a place where everyone could contribute, regardless of where they came from or what challenges they faced. The unity that began within the walls of the community center spread throughout the neighborhood. Parents who had once hesitated to get involved now volunteered regularly, inspired by the changes they saw in their children. The local grocery store offered to donate snacks for workshops, and a nearby cafe hosted fundraising events to support the scholarship fund. James found himself busier than ever, but it was a different kind of busy, one that energized rather than drained him. Late nights at the hospital were now balanced with early mornings at the center, where he'd meet with students and discuss their goals. Laura, standing beside him, coordinated logistics and connected with families who needed extra guidance. One evening, as they closed up the center, Laura turned to James. "It feels like we're finally doing what we were meant to," she said, her eyes soft with reflection. James nodded. "It's more than I ever imagined." As the school year progressed, Crestwood recognized Derek and Caleb's contributions. During a school assembly, the principal announced that Voices for Change would be formally integrated into Crestwood's extracurricular programs, ensuring that its mission would continue long after Derek and Caleb graduated. The boys stood on stage as their peers applauded, their faces reflecting a mix of pride and humility. Dr. Harrison stepped up to the microphone. "This isn't just about academic success," he said. "It's about what we do with that success to lift others. Derek and Caleb have shown us that true leadership comes from service." After the assembly, students and teachers alike congratulated the boys. Even those who had once been skeptical were now supportive. Their perceptions changed by months of watching Derek and Caleb lead by example. One Saturday, James arrived at the community center to find Caleb coaching a group of kids through a chess game. Derek was in another corner, explaining a complex math problem to an eager crowd. The room hummed with energy, filled with laughter and focused concentration. Mrs. Wilson, who had come to watch, sat beside James. "Look at them," she said, pride clear in her voice. "They've come so far." "They have," James agreed. He felt a warmth in his chest, knowing that the legacy Emily started was alive and thriving. It was no longer just about two boys finding their place. It was about an entire community learning to believe in itself. One afternoon, James received a letter from a former student of Emily's who had moved away. She had read about Voices for Change in the newspaper and wanted to share how Emily's tutoring had changed her life. "I never had the chance to thank her," the letter read. "But seeing what you and the boys are doing now, I think she'd be proud. I hope you know how much of a difference you're making." James showed the letter to Derek and Caleb, who read it silently before passing it to Laura. The weight of Emily's influence, even after all these years, settled over them with a comforting certainty. "Her impact goes further than we'll ever know," Laura said, her voice catching with emotion. As winter approached, Crestwood announced that Derek and Caleb had both been selected as candidates for prestigious college scholarships. The news sent a wave of excitement through the community center, where students saw firsthand what was possible with hard work and support. James and Laura helped the boys prepare for their scholarship interviews, offering advice and sharing stories of resilience. The boys practiced answering questions, their confidence growing with each session. Caleb paused during one practice interview and looked at James. "If we do get these scholarships, it's because of everything you, Emily, and everyone here taught us." James smiled, a mix of pride and bittersweet reflection. "No," he said, "it's because of who you are. We just helped you see it." When the acceptance letters came, Derek and Caleb opened them together at the community center, surrounded by James, Laura, Mrs. Parker, and Mrs. Wilson. The room erupted in cheers when they read the words, "Congratulations! You have been selected." Tears of joy and relief filled James's eyes. Laura hugged the boys, and Mrs. Parker clapped her hands, beaming. That evening, as the community celebrated, James stood outside, looking up at the sky. The stars were bright, the air crisp with the promise of a new beginning. Laura joined him, slipping her arm through his. "Emily would be so proud," she whispered. "She already is," James said, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. It was the end of one chapter and the start of another, a journey shaped by love, loss, and the belief that hope could grow even in the hardest places. The final school event of the year was graduation day. Derek and Caleb stood at the podium, their gowns crisp and their voices steady as they addressed the audience. "3 years ago, we stood at the grave of a friend who believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves," Derek began. "Today we stand here not just as students, but as part of a community that chose to see us as more," Caleb continued. "Emily taught us that true success is measured not just by what you achieve, but by who you help along the way. And that's what we'll carry with us, wherever we go." James and Laura sat in the audience, surrounded by friends and supporters, their hearts full. The applause was thunderous, a testament to the journey that had begun in grief but ended in triumph. Years later, Voices for Change had chapters across multiple schools, and the community center had expanded to offer even more resources. Derek and Caleb, now college graduates, returned regularly to mentor the next generation. James and Laura stood at the back of the center, watching as a new group of kids played chess and solved math problems. Laughter and conversation filling the air. The ache of loss still lingered, but was now intertwined with the joy of knowing that Emily's light had not dimmed. It had only spread. "You did it, Em," James whispered, feeling her presence as strongly as ever. "We all did." The impact of Voices for Change continued to resonate long after Derek and Caleb's graduation. The club's influence spread to other schools, inspiring new mentorship programs across the city. At Crestwood, a mural was commissioned in honor of Emily and the club's founders. It depicted students of all backgrounds reaching for the same bright sky, a symbol of unity and hope. James stood with Laura at the unveiling, surrounded by students, teachers, and community members. Mrs. Parker spoke first, her voice clear and strong. "This mural isn't just art. It's a reminder that every act of kindness ripple outward, touching lives in ways we can't always see." Derek and Caleb, now college students, had returned for the occasion. Derek approached James, a smile breaking across his face. "Feels like coming full circle, doesn't it?" he said. James nodded, his eyes misty. "It does, and it's only the beginning." One evening, James sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in front of him. The house was quieter these days, but the silence was no longer suffocating. It felt peaceful. As he flipped through letters from students who had benefited from the scholarship fund, an idea began to form. The next day, he shared it with Laura and Mrs. Parker at the community center. What if we expanded the scholarship fund into a foundation that supports not just educational programs, but leadership initiatives in underprivileged areas, he proposed. Laura's eyes lit up. "That could change so many lives," she said. "We'd need a board, partnerships, and funding. But I think we can do it." Mrs. Parker grinned. "Count me in. We've got a lot of work to do." Over the next year, James and Laura worked tirelessly with a team of volunteers and community leaders to establish the Emily Callahan Foundation for Leadership and Opportunity. The foundation offered grants for students to attend leadership conferences, workshops, and educational programs, and provided mentorship opportunities that mirrored what Derek and Caleb had experienced. The first cohort of students selected by the foundation included bright, determined kids who reminded James of Derek and Caleb. Among them was a girl named Amara, who had a knack for chess and wanted to study engineering. She beamed as she accepted her scholarship certificate, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I won't let you down." James felt a lump in his throat as he shook her hand. "You won't," he said. "Just remember, you're capable of more than you know." Derek and Caleb, now in their junior year of college, came back to speak at the Foundation's first major event. They stood on the stage in front of a packed audience at the community center, which had been decorated with photos of Emily and the students she inspired. "Coming back here reminds us of where we started," Derek said, his voice steady. "But it's not just about looking back. It's about looking forward and helping others see what they're capable of." Caleb added, "We're here because someone believed in us when we didn't. And now, it's our turn to pass that belief on." Their words were met with applause and nods of agreement. The event was a testament to the power of community, resilience, and the enduring legacy of one young woman who had dared to believe in others. The Foundation's work didn't stop in Boston. As word spread, similar programs were launched in neighboring cities, each one tailored to the unique needs of its community. James and Laura traveled to conferences and schools to share their story and encourage other educators to adopt similar models. One day, during a presentation at a national education conference, a young teacher approached James afterward. "I read about Emily and what you've done in her memory," she said. "It inspired me to start a mentorship program at my school." James felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it was accompanied by a smile. That's exactly what Emily would have wanted. While the foundation grew, so did the relationships at its heart. James and Laura, now comfortable in their new roles, found themselves reconnecting in ways they hadn't expected. They shared the work, the late-night planning sessions, and the quiet moments of reflection that came after a successful event. One evening, after a particularly long day, Laura looked at James over a stack of grant proposals. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said, a soft smile playing at her lips. "How loss led us here." James nodded, reaching for her hand. "It's like Emily guided us, not just to help Derek and Caleb, but to rebuild ourselves." They sat in the quiet office of the community center, the light from the street lamp casting long shadows. The grief that had once kept them apart now bound them together, softened by purpose and shared memories. The Foundation's first annual gala was held in the grand auditorium of Crestwood Academy. The theme was Bridging Gaps, Building Futures, and the event was attended by students, parents, educators, and community leaders. The walls were decorated with photos of past and current scholarship recipients, including Derek and Caleb. Derek stood at the podium, his speech prepared, but his voice carrying a natural ease. "We are here tonight not just to celebrate what has been achieved, but to commit to what's still possible," he said. "Emily taught us that our potential is not defined by our starting point, but by the path we choose to walk and the people who walk it with us." Caleb followed, his voice steady and full of gratitude. "We all have a role in someone else's story. Sometimes we don't know what it means until later, but every act of support, every moment of kindness, it matters." James and Laura stood side by side, surrounded by applause, their hearts full. The room was filled with people who had once been strangers, but now felt like family. As the gala wound down and the guests began to leave, James found himself outside, looking up at the stars. Laura joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, glancing at the glow of the city lights mixed with the constellations. "It is," James replied. "It feels like a new chapter." Inside, Derek and Caleb were laughing with friends, surrounded by students who looked up to them. The community center continued to thrive, the work of the foundation expanding, and new leaders stepping up to continue what they had started. Years later, James sat in the audience at another graduation, this time for Amara, the girl who had once thanked him with tear-filled eyes. She stood at the podium, ready to give her valedictorian speech. "When I started, I didn't know what I was capable of," she began. "But there were people who saw something in me, even when I didn't. They taught me that believing in others is just as important as believing in yourself." James felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. The work they had started continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't have predicted. As he listened, surrounded by students, parents, and friends, James closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, "We did it, Emmy. Your light never faded." A few weeks after the gala, James received an invitation to speak at an educational summit in New York City. The topic was community-based mentorship programs, and the Emily Callahan Foundation was highlighted as a model for positive change. Laura, Derek, and Caleb joined him, eager to share their experiences and learn from other community leaders. As James walked onto the stage, he scanned the audience and noticed a familiar face, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes who had been one of Emily's teachers. Mrs. Landry had retired years ago, but had always encouraged Emily's interest in mentorship and service. James felt a lump form in his throat as he began his speech. "This journey started with a loss so profound, it reshaped my world," he said, his voice steady. "But from that grief, a seed of hope grew, nurtured by people who believed that one life could inspire many." After the presentation, Mrs. Landry approached him. "You know, Emily always said she wanted to change the world," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "I think she's done just that, through all of you." The summit was more than a platform to share stories. It was an opportunity to form new partnerships. Representatives from schools and community centers across the country reached out, eager to replicate the Foundation's model in their own neighborhoods. Derek and Caleb led workshops during the summit, teaching other young leaders how to start mentorship programs and advocate for change in their schools. Watching them engage with students from different backgrounds, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Laura, ever the organizer, exchanged contact information with educators and nonprofits. "This could be the beginning of something even bigger," she said to James as they packed up their materials. James nodded. Emily's vision is spreading. When they returned to Boston, the energy from the summit invigorated the community center. New volunteers signed up, and plans for expanded programs were put into motion. James and Laura held meetings with city officials to discuss funding and resources, ensuring that the foundation could continue to grow. Derek and Caleb, now mentors themselves, balanced their college courses with regular visits to the center. They saw echoes of their younger selves in the students who attended, full of uncertainty, but brimming with potential. One afternoon, Amara, who was now preparing for college, approached Derek with a smile. "Do you think I could help lead a workshop next year?" she asked. Derek grinned. "Absolutely. You're readier than you know." The following spring, the foundation hosted its first day of service, inviting students, parents, and volunteers to work on community projects, from planting trees to repainting playgrounds. The event was a success, reinforcing the foundation's mission to create leaders who cared not just about academic success, but about their communities. James watched as groups of students worked side by side, painting murals and cleaning up parks. The air was filled with laughter and conversation, the city buzzing with life and connection. Laura stood beside him, clipboard in hand, but eyes sparkling as she watched the volunteers. "Look at them," she said, her voice full of pride. "They're building something real." James nodded, unable to suppress a smile. "It's more than we ever imagined." As the sun set on the day of service, Derek and Caleb gathered a group of students around the community center's front steps. They shared stories about their early days at Crestwood, the challenges they faced, and how the center had given them a second home. Caleb looked out over the crowd and took a breath. "It's not just about what you achieve, it's about what you leave behind for others. That's what Emily taught us, and it's what we hope to pass on to all of you." James felt Laura's hand slip into his. They exchanged a glance, understanding in their shared silence that this was more than a culmination. It was the continuation of a legacy that began with one girl's belief in others. The crowd dispersed, but the energy lingered, an unspoken promise that the work would go on. James stood back as the center lights glowed in the twilight, casting long, warm shadows that seemed to whisper Emily's presence. "We're still moving forward, Em," he whispered to the night sky, a tear rolling down his cheek. "And we always will." As the screen fades out from the final scene of James standing in front of the glowing community center, a soft, uplifting melody plays. The video then transitions to a simple, heartfelt message on the screen. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content that highlights stories of hope, resilience, and the power of community. Your support helps keep these stories alive and brings awareness to the importance of mentorship and education. A subscribe button with a gentle animation appears, followed by a prompt to click on other related videos or playlists featuring similar narratives.